I worked out it's been about 33 years since I came out here. My best man and housemate of the time was doing his PhD back in the early 80s, and in fact I knew quite a lot of folks doing their PhDs out here then, while I was doing mine in town. So I want to talk about energy, and particularly the challenge of decarbonisation. So I'm talking about the global energy transition. When I talk about that, I really mean this idea that we have to transition the economy to a low carbon world. And I'll specifically want to look at the challenges and the opportunities that we see, because I actually think it's a bigger challenge than anyone appreciates. And so it's virtually impossible, but along the way there may be some really interesting opportunities. So I'm really going to talk about things from two perspectives, the Energy Initiative and the Dow Centre. I sort of have the two hats. They blur a bit at the edges, but in both cases, I guess the strategy from the beginning has been that I'm interested in things that can move the needle. So we have a lot of energy research going on at UQ, for stuff on batteries, stuff on algae biofuels. It's not to say it's not great research, but we put it through a screening process which says, what are the prospects of it making a real difference in the world at scale? So unless it makes a huge difference at scale, it isn't going to help decarbonise the world. And so the sort of test is, it's got to be environmentally and socially acceptable. It then has to be economic and scalable to be viable. And then ultimately there has to be a pull from the market and capital, infrastructure capital to make it investable. So unless we can sort of see a path towards that, we probably don't work on it. And so I'm really going to focus on four, just giving you a skim of four things that I'm interested in. One is energy access and poverty. One is carbon capture and storage. That's really in the Energy Initiative. And then in the Dow Centre, this whole idea of trying to model energy transitions and how rapidly you can decarbonise. And then I want to look at some opportunities around the utilisation of natural gas without producing CO2, but particularly in the industrial sector. So to set the scene though, and to sort of put this challenge into context, I want to talk about three socio-economic megatrends. These are things that over the last century give us a picture of what the future might be like. Obviously, the past doesn't tell the story of the future, but it gives us some indicators. And the first one is, this is a plot of population growth. So, from a population just 60 years ago of less than 3 billion to 7.5 billion today, and then the median forecast is by the end of this century somewhere around 10, and that there's an 80% chance, they say, that will be somewhere between 8 and 12. So what's interesting though during this transition is that primary energy demand in the world actually went skyrocketed as well. So from something in the order of 4 billion tonnes of oil equivalent, so this is coal, oil, natural gas, solar, you name it, whatever energy sources you need, put them all on an oil equivalent basis, and so you go from 4 to about 14. And so whilst the population doubled, or a bit more than doubled, 2.5 times, energy demand actually went up by more than 3 times. So there's a coupling there between population growth and energy demand. Similarly, GDP. So if you look in history, back in 1950, GDP was sitting down at just a couple of $1 trillion US. In 2015, it's about $75 trillion US. So it's a massive increase in GDP, small scale there. But interestingly, the forecast going forward 50 years is for it to reach somewhere in the order of 300 trillion, so another 4 times. And again, you map that primary energy demand onto that, and you start to say, well, there's never been a time in history where we haven't seen a direct coupling between energy use and both GDP and population growth. So the prospects for energy going forward are enormous. The third one is urbanisation. So this is a plot of people living rural areas and urban areas. So on this bottom area, this is the developed world. So the OECD countries, the richest billion or so. And you'll see that the darker brown there is the amount of people living in rural areas, and the lighter brown is the number of people living in cities. And there's been a slow, but A, the population in OECD countries is relatively stable. B, the split between urban and city is relatively stable, but we're still moving to cities. But then you move to the developing world, where all the population growth is going to occur pretty much. But an enormous amount of those is going to be in cities, either rural people transitioning to cities or new cities being built for these emerging populations. And by and large, the population grows in rural but transitions or migrates to urban. So the interesting thing about this is that cities typically consume 70% of the world's energy and produce 70% of the world's CO2, despite historically having less than half the people. And so as we urbanise and we build new cities and so forth, we should expect, again, another trend which is all about more energy and more carbon. So that's just a bit of context. The other one I want to talk about is putting the equity side of it in context. So we think about how much carbon we produce, how much energy we use, but there's a lot of people who don't have it. So this is where we all live, right? The richest 1 billion people emit 10 tonnes of CO2 per person. So, one question I often ask, how many people in the room took an overseas flight in the last 12 months? Most. So that automatically takes you to, it depends where you went, of course, but it automatically gets you somewhere in this area, right? So it's before your car, before your fridges, before your lights, before all the bits of society that you rely on, you've gone and consumed this 10. If you're like me, who took, or probably Neville here, who have taken something like 10, then we're sort of way off this scale, right? So that's where we're all living. All of you are living somewhere in this range. There are 3 billion people in the world who emit less than 1, right? So these people have virtually no energy access. They rely on things like biomass, dung, wood, etc. that they collect. That provides all the lighting, heating, cooking facilities and so forth. But of course they aspire to move up this chain. And so where we're trying to get to, though, is a world where pretty much all of us have to be living at this level in terms of carbon dioxide. And at the moment, the average in the world is about here, and the target's down at 1. So what's driving this future? It's all about these socio-economic megatrends. So we're sitting here in 2016 with 7.34 billion people, and it clicks over every day, as you know, every minute. We're talking about each of us earning around $10,000 per person on a purchasing parity basis. Half of us, roughly, living in cities, that amount of energy, 550 exajoules or 13 billion tonnes of oil, half of that consumed in the rich countries, 2/3 of it in cities, and we've got global emissions at around 34 billion tonnes. Now, in 2066, so I sort of did this last year and rolled it forward 50 years, and the best estimates we can get would be a population of 10 billion, each of us earning 3 times more, so 300 trillion of GDP. 7 billion, so an extra 3.5 billion people move to cities. We consume energy, and this is taking into account enormous amounts of energy efficiency and sort of some decoupling of both population and GDP to energy, but around 20 billion tonnes of oil equivalent. So it's like, hopefully it's in the form of other types of energy, but it's still more than 50% more. This trend where now the poorer countries, not so much poorer because they're going to get richer, but non-OECD countries as we know them, go from half the energy consumption to 70%, and 80% of global energy is now used in cities. And who knows where CO2 will be, but if you look at these trends and the connections that we've talked about, the likelihood is we're headed for a fairly carbon-intensive future. Now, that's what are people predicting? So this is the business as usual trend, right? So we're going to hit 2100 and we're going to be emitting at least 80 billion tonnes of CO2 equivalent. We all know about the Paris Agreement, so the commitment to keep global warming at no more than 2 degrees C and to do all that we can to keep it to 1.5. Well, that's what these two graphs look like. You'll see much more sophisticated models, but at the end of the day, they're all cartoons. None of us have a view about what's really going to happen. So this is as good a cartoon, but effectively it means that from about 2020, early 2020s, we have to have an abrupt commencement of the reduction in emissions, and by end of century, the world has to be at net zero emissions if you want to achieve 2 degrees. If you want to achieve 1.5, the world has to do so the same thing, except it's got to bring it forward. It realistically should start earlier, and it must be all over by 2060 to net zero emissions. And even those sorts of curves, we're talking about roughly a 50 to 67% probability that we will hit 2 degrees. So that means there's still a 1 in 2 or 1 in 3 chance that we would exceed the 2 degrees C target. And of course, the thing that I then say is when I look at all that inertia in the system and we're growing populations and we're trying to get richer and we've got, 3 billion people in the world without access to energy even, the more likely scenario in my mind might be that we manage to halt the growth and hold that for a couple of decades while we bring people out of poverty, while we make these transitions to new energy technologies, while we improve our efficiency. If we were to do that and then go on this pathway, so more of a slow transition, although that's still pretty significant, that would see us with, according to models, at least a 3 degrees C rise. And so, none of us know where we will go. I mean, a bunch of politicians in Paris high-fiving and congratulating each other on a statement is not even a commitment to do anything. But these are all plausible possible outcomes of the future. So we decided that people do these integrated assessment models. So if I go back to this, these here, they have integrated assessment models where they can force that to happen. And this is one typical one. This is from Energy Technology Perspectives by the International Energy Agency. And effectively what they do is they say, if you remember our cartoon, this is stretched out, but this is the cartoon where it was heading in that direction. They've got some new policies in place now that they say, well, if they all happen, we could be here. And this is the path that the sharper green line I had that takes us down to net zero by 2100. And they basically fill in, they say, we're here today, we have to be here, and so we will fill in this transition with the lowest cost technologies. So basically we force ourselves to reduce emissions, and we find the lowest cost way to do that. And we find that's pretty expensive, so this bit here is all about efficiency. So we will decouple GDP and population growth and actually just use energy more efficiently. So about half the task, 45% of the task, is actually by consuming less per unit of activity, which is pretty ambitious. And the rest are just the lowest cost things. So there is no attention in these to how fast you can actually build stuff. So how fast can you procure? What materials will you run out of? What skills will you run out of? It's all just assumed. It's done by economists who say, give me a market signal and stuff happens. And as engineers, we sort of say to ourselves, well, is that right? And so we have a couple of questions here. Could the pace of deployment be limited by materials and natural resources, or human resources and skills, or manufacturing facilities? And to what extent might they be region specific? So some things are no borders, so some commodities trade beautifully between borders and there's no barriers. But for example, skilled labour engineering, for example, doesn't necessarily migrate from one country to another easily. And so this is a pretty complicated process. It's never been done before, and we've started this sort of modelling work at UQ. And so what we've got is that, we conceived the idea. We now have a consortium coming together which involves Princeton University and Carnegie Mellon, Potsdam in Germany, IASA in Vienna, IoT Bombay and Tsinghua, and that grouping is really picked by taking the Americas, Europe, India and China and saying, if we can work it out for them, we've worked it out for 85% of the problem. Obviously, we don't even look at Australia, so we're there as kind of the project leaders. Our focus is going to be on Southeast Asia and its connection into China and India. But the rest of these are focused on Europe, these are the Americas, and India and China, obviously. We've raised a bit of money so far to support it. Probably we would have spent 500,000 on this exercise to date. It's the sort of project that is going to need about 50 million over 10 years. It's a massive undertaking. We have some interest from people like BP and Exxon. What we've got to do is broaden that base, so we actually haven't accepted any funds from them yet, on the basis that if they were to be investing in this and help us discover that this transition is impossible and that we're going to be relying on fossil fuels a whole lot longer, I think the world's going to say, well, of course, Exxon paid for that, you'd expect that. So we're currently trying to raise funds from other sources as well. The way it works, we start with a global equilibrium model. So this is a computational model that is basically a model of all of the economic parameters, population growth, trade flows in the world. There's several of these models. We've picked one specifically that was from the original, what they call GTAP model, and has been developed in Australia actually by BA Economics, originally, first of all, by ABARE. And what that does is give us the core. So you start to put in carbon reduction targets, and what it does is drive different technologies into the market, drives different trade behaviour and so forth, and different use of energy. What that does then is we feed that back into models that look at natural capital, so resources, reserves, manufactured materials, etc., that are going to go in to make these technologies. Human capital, so you do engineers and skilled welders, and then manufactured capital is factories, things that produce solar panels, steel pipes, etc. The financial, in terms of capital allocation, happens up inside here. So we end up with this theoretical deployment rate, which is what the other assessment models do. We feed it back through here, and that gives us a maximum theoretical deployment rate based on real constraints. Now, what we then do is we take those and we go region by, so these are all region by region, but now we're looking at socio-political issues, so things like public acceptance, things like regulatory maturity and so forth. So for example, if I was, the cartoons from the IEA that I talk about, CCS, which is an area I worked in for a fair while before I retired, carbon capture and storage is something that the IEA thinks will do about 17% of the global decarbonisation target. Sounds simple. It's it's smaller than solar, etc., etc. When you unpack it, what it actually means is that by 2020, the world is going to be injecting 7 billion tonnes a year of CO2 into the ground. When you look at 7 billion tonnes a year of CO2, that's the equivalent of the global oil and gas production on the planet today. So it's pretty similar, right? You take CO2 to a supercritical phase and you inject it into reservoirs. It's almost the same process as extracting oil and gas, but in reverse. It takes the same amount of exploration and appraisal, it's the same amount of development costs and so forth. And so this idea that in the next 30 years, we are going to build the entire global oil and gas production capacity in reverse, to me, is completely implausible. And the first measure I do is I say, how many oil and gas exploration and production rigs are on the planet today? The answer is about 7,000, 6,500 to 7,000. Half of them are roughly working onshore. Half of those are in the US. How many are working on carbon capture and storage exploration? None, or maybe there's one working on production. And the answer is I can count them on, depending on the day of the month, I can count them on either one hand or two hands, but I don't need any toes. So 7,000 rigs working on oil and gas, 5 or 10 working on CCS. You tell me how I connect that to a global oil and gas production rate in just 25, 30 years. So that's an example where, you know, you've got physical constraints here, which actually slows what is plausible, but you've also then got a whole issue of public acceptance. So, for example, Europe has quite a lot of CCS built into the models. It is almost implausible that Germany will allow onshore carbon storage. So they've had a number of demonstration projects that have been cancelled, simply not because of any other technical reason. They had the costs, they had the financial support, simply because public opposition will not allow injection of CO2, a bit like fracking. You know, they won't allow fracking for unconventional gas in Germany, and they won't allow carbon storage. So this part of the model is about, you know, it might be public opposition in that case. It might be regulatory maturity in the case of some other technologies. It might be local incentives, you know, might be competing land use, all sorts of things that get considered in this area here. Okay, so that's the modelling work we do about the transition. And one of the things I'll just, for now, all I'll do is take you through a couple of insights that have come up. One was obvious and has always been on my mind, and this is the resilience of coal. So, you know, coal gets phased out in these models by 2060, completely phased out, right? This is a picture of the plant age of coal-fired power plants in the world today, right? So most of them are less than 60 years old. Red is China, blue is US, green is Europe, brown is India, and that's the rest of the world, which is primarily places like Southeast Asia, a little bit of Africa, and a little bit of Eastern Europe. So the interesting thing for me here is that roughly a terawatt, 1,000 gigawatts, about 1,000 of Stanwell power stations are currently less than 20 years old, and they're all in developing countries pretty much. So what we're saying is, for these transitions to happen, somehow these assets are going to retire early. Question is, how early? So what we did is we took one of those models that predict 2 degrees C and basically analysed those 4 countries and said, what's going to happen with their existing coal fleets? So this is not taking into account plans to build new coal plants that are on the table right now. This is taking into account what has been built or what is under construction. And so what you see is, say for China, current average retirement age is somewhere in the order of 50 years. That drops to 15 by 2035. India, same, drops from 55 years down to 15 years. Oh, sorry, that's India there. Europe does the same, and the US does the same, but of course they have much fewer numbers. And so you see that China bears the brunt of the load, basically having to retire assets well before, not only well before their economic useful life, which has typically been 40 to 50 years, but before the loan tenors will be up in most of those cases. Prospects of that, to me, look slim. You know, I just don't think there'll be the socio-political support in those countries to do that. When I talk to people in China or India about this, they say, oh, well, yes, it is completely plausible, but someone will have to compensate. And someone is us, the West, the people who have enjoyed the growth based on fossil fuel utilisation over the last century are somehow going to have to compensate that. Certainly in a Trump-led United States, that ain't happening. And it's probably not happening here under any circumstances either. Okay, so the next one, just as a little insight, is labour. So this is India and the US, and so what we do is we get data on how many people are associated with building, operating, and providing the inputs to these different power technologies. This is electricity only. And so you've got solar thermal, concentrating solar thermal, PV, offshore wind, onshore wind, hydro, this one is biomass, coal, oil, natural gas, and the red is nuclear. So what's interesting here, you see a lot of biomass, and you say, well, why is there so much biomass? Well, that's India. That biomass is all that dung and twigs and that most of their energy is being provided with today. It actually, so the jobs, this is jobs indirect and direct, so this is people collecting this stuff, right? Lots and lots of jobs. Obviously the transition has to happen, but what's interesting is the coal industry transitions to virtually zero employment by 2050. Now, you know, the socio-economic implications of the coal mining sector closing in India, I think, are enormous. It's an even worse picture when you look at China. But then here's solar. This transition where, you know, suddenly we pile in and add, you know, several billion jobs into the solar sector in the space of a few years. So you take all the jobs out of coal and we put them all in solar. You know, things don't happen like that, and certainly none of the education and training activity going on in India is planning for that. The US is a similar sort of story. You'll see here it has a lot of biomass being added, and that's because in these models, that's one of the cheapest ways that you're able to get low carbon. So the idea is that the biomass sucks CO2 out of the atmosphere while it's growing. You harvest it, you turn it into electricity or fuel, and you emit CO2, but it's on balance, it's neutral, so it's better than anything else. This thing here, the shaded areas, are CCS, carbon capture and storage. So that's just for the US. You'll see a little bit happening in India, but in the US, Europe, those sort of countries, we've got a lot of CCS happening. The reason we do it on biomass is the idea of negative emissions. So the fact is the biomass is asserted to absorb as much CO2 as it's possibly going to emit, and therefore is carbon neutral if you don't do CCS. If you capture the CO2 as it's coming away from the power station and inject it in the ground, then it becomes negative CO2. So it actually is pulling CO2 out of the atmosphere. A huge amount of that has to happen to reach 2 degrees C. You don't see much of it in the 2050 timeframe, but in all these integrated assessment models, negative emissions through BECCS, bioenergy with CCS, happens in the second half of the century. So that first one where it shows us on the path, the only way you get down to zero is by negative emissions. Now, I was at a conference at Princeton last year, and somebody asked me what my opinion of BECCS was, because it is such an important part to all the integrated assessment models. And for me, it barely passes the laugh test. So you take two technologies that have consistently and dramatically underperformed our targets and expectations, bioenergy and CCS, and you rely on coupling the two to save the day in the second half of the century. You know, it's courageous. So what this does, this is now putting together the supply chain side, or you know, the human, natural capital, etc., of our model. So, for example, if we take the unconstrained, so we say we're not going to constrain. We're just going to constrain natural capitals, right? So it's just materials. You see, we get out of coal really quickly, natural gas really quickly, and we do lots of hydro, wind, etc., biomass. On the left-hand side is where we actually constrain retirement. So we say instead of letting all these coal-fired power plants retire at any time between, so it's 15 years was the average. What actually happens is some of those coal plants are retiring at 5 years, some are retiring at 30, but on average 15. What we've done is say the coal plants will have a retirement age with a mean of 40 years. There'll be a distribution around that sort of, P90 is at 55 and the P10 is at 35. But at the end of the day, coal plants will not retire at 5 years old or 15 years old. They will serve to an average. And of course, then there's a much slower transition out of coal, and of course, the emissions profile here is a lot higher than the emissions profile here. So that's sort of the first indications of the work that we're doing in that front. So I mentioned earlier about access, the 3 billion who don't have. So I'll talk a little bit about what we did here. The Energy and Poverty Group is something, when I first came to UQ, there was nothing happening in this area, so we're lots of solar and lots of what you do in the West. It just struck me that this was a gaping hole in our research portfolio when it was such an important issue in the transition. So we managed to, in fact, I made a donation, and then we leveraged that up with some industry funds and some strategic funds from the Vice-Chancellor. So we managed to put together a group which now has 10 PhD students, 2 postdocs now, and about 6 academic staff working across different disciplines. All the PhD students must do field work in India, so they're typically spending between 1 to 6 months a year working in the field in India. They work in a range of areas, so people who model try to look at the big transition and understand how somewhere like India can transition out of an impoverished situation to prosperity without doing the carbon emission thing. How the private sector can play a role, because these are all very poor people, so how the private sector can put in place business cases that make sense. Community development issues, gender and equity issues. So there's a portfolio of projects. It's very multidisciplinary, and interestingly, when I first sort of set it up, I had ideas for lots of GIS mapping of energy resources and engineering solutions. Virtually all the students who came in the first round wanted to work on things like, understanding social norms that stopped people taking up new energy solutions, understanding business models, the economics of it, the political side of it. So it's been quite an interesting development. This is one piece of work from one of the guys who's basically looked back through history and tried to look at how human development index emerges versus CO2 intensity. And so he's done it for all of the countries of the world. I'll just do that again. You'll see here what this does is go from 1990 to 2014, I think it is. And you'll see that basically every country runs up this. So the colour codes are very high human development index, high, medium, and low. And you see that China, for example, went from medium to high. India went from low to high. But all of them seem to follow this sort of trend here, where we have to increase our carbon intensity in order to develop the human development index, and then we level out at a very high human development index, but carbon emissions just keep going that way. And the size of the graphs are population based, so obviously India and China stand out. What he also did then was to go and break each country down into deciles, well, quintiles mainly, but some he's done in deciles. So for example, we talked about China. So this is China. This is, the bottom quintile, next. So China as an aggregate is sitting up here in the high case, but it's got some that are in medium. India, of course, has from low, quite low, through to high. And the interesting thing for me is that we set emissions targets and obligations based on country level things. But the reality is there is a lot more wealthy, high emissions intensity people living in India and China than there are in Australia. So somehow we have to actually bring it down to individuals, and wealth seems to be the main driver of this, where it doesn't matter what country you live in. If you're at the wealthy end of the spectrum, you are likely to be very energy intensive and carbon intensive, and you shouldn't be let off the hook from this obligation to decarbonise. And then this other one was just interesting. So this person is an economist who was working in the state government. So the other interesting thing about that group of PhDs, every one of them came to us with at least 10 years practical experience. And one was a CEO in an energy company in the US who decided he wanted to retire and save the world. But what this guy looks at is trying to transition people from the traditional firewood stoves. So in addition to them having no energy access, there's about 4 million people a year die from indoor pollution. So it's worse than the outdoor pollution situation in China. And so what we find is, though, even when someone like the UN comes in and gives 40 million clean cook stoves, they sit in the corner, they don't use them. And so there's a whole bunch of tradition and social norms and, you know, husbands saying, well, the wife's job is to cook in the kitchen with a wood stove, and my chapatis taste better when it's made on wood. That's what you'll keep doing. So he's been trying to understand those and find positive deviance where you find whole communities have made the transition. Down the road 10 kilometres, there's a community who had all access to the same opportunity, but just hasn't made the transition. So that's what he works in. The next thing I want to do is talk about the fact that it's not all about electricity. We hear lots about electricity. We hear a little bit about transportation fuels. We don't hear much about industry. And so what we're interested in is things like steel, cement and petrochemicals, which are, you know, getting towards 1/3 of global greenhouse gas emissions. How do we decarbonise those? Because there's not a whole lot of research. And we think methane, as in natural gas, has a real role to play. It's a bit hard to say that with a straight face in Australia, where we've got a methane shortage. Well, we have plenty of methane, we just don't produce it. But certainly, if we look at world resources, methane looks like a pretty good opportunity. So we start particularly with iron and steel because of its importance to Australia, and then petrochemicals. And we looked at all the technologies that are currently available, including CCS. And the conclusion we look at is all of them are cost competitive. So most of these technologies need the best of them. CCS was probably the best for iron and steel. Needs a carbon price of about a CO2 price of about $100 a tonne to make sense. And so, you know, I actually don't see $100 a tonne coming anytime soon. So we need better solutions than that. So what we've been doing is looking at molten salt halides to basically facilitate the production of CO2-free hydrogen and things like iron. So hydrogen without CO2, basically we pyrolyse in a molten salt and feed methane in. The carbon comes off as a solid, the hydrogen comes off, it works really well. We've done it in the lab, we model it, and we think we can compete with conventional steam reforming of methane, which is the way we produce 99% of world hydrogen, for about $30 a tonne of CO2. So it's, you know, again, we haven't got $30 a tonne of CO2 anywhere either, but it's half looking sensible. And more recently, we've been trying to do this in one reactor, which we think will reduce the capital intensity and get that number down. Okay, the next one, iron ore reduction. This is the one that's most interesting for me. And in essence, what we started with is we said, okay, we've got to reduce iron ore. We use coke and coal for that. We produce lots of CO2. The other one we do is we take methane, we produce higher hydrocarbons, and in that case, we also produce lots of CO2. So with our molten salt technology, we said, well, what can we do about coupling these? And basically, we create this coupled reaction. We produce higher hydrocarbons, we produce iron zero, and we produce water. The challenge for this is it's a pretty straightforward reaction to this point. Then we have electrolysis, which is very energy intensive. And so obviously we lose, even though we produce no CO2 up to this point, if we use electricity that's made out of coal, then obviously we're going to produce some CO2 in that step. This is also a step that's pretty complicated and it doesn't scale well. Right? So it's energy intensive, it doesn't scale well, so we thought we needed something else. So that we found, and we published this because we think that's too far out of the money, $30 to $40 a tonne of CO2 to be competitive with blast furnaces. Having said that, blast furnaces with CCS need about 100. So it's more competitive if the blast furnace industry has to decarbonise, but it's still not quite enough to get the industry excited. So what we've done is we've subsequently come up with a coupling of our methane pyrolysis process and iron reduction in molten salts, and we've now managed to produce basically iron zero, carbon black, and hydrogen. And we're still doing the economics of that, but it looks like it will be much more economic than the previous one, and the process looks doable. Certainly in the lab we're able to repeat it pretty well. The challenge for that though is really this. The world has 100 years of blast furnace iron making experience. They've got lots of plants, they've got lots of intellectual capital invested in that. Transitioning that industry to something which is more akin to petrochemicals to me looks like a massive challenge. So even though I think that technology can really play a role, I think this is going to be a slow transition. But we're trying to get BHP at least on board at the moment. Last thing I want to talk about is carbon capture and storage. Even though I've said it's really expensive, and it is, I ran ZeroGen before I came to UQ, made the decision to kill it. Best decision we made, because at the same time as we took that decision in the US, they took a decision to build one. I got crucified in the press over this decision because we were letting the rest of the world lead. My estimate was 7 billion. Their estimate was 2.3. They sanctioned their project, we killed ours. They just abandoned theirs after 5 years of building it and $7.5 billion US of capital. They abandoned it and said they can't get it to work. So I feel a bit vindicated, albeit did myself out of a job back then. So, but I think carbon capture and storage will prove to be important, and that legacy fleet of coal plants that I talked about, and the blast furnace iron making in the world and the cement plants in the world. Even if we come up with a revolutionary technology, I think the amount of inertia in those industries means there's going to be a lot of coal in the system for a lot of time to come, at least the next 50, 60, 70 years. And when you look at all the growth that we have to do in the energy sector, you can add the new technologies on for the growth challenge, but the base load that we've had for history is going to be with us for some time. So basically because of the experience we had, we don't do things like new capture technologies. We have some academics in UQ who are. What we're more interested in doing is understanding the value of the option to the country. And we're interested in this to China, India, elsewhere, which is all about understanding the storage assets that you might have. Because at the end of the day, if you don't have scalable, acceptable in terms of regulation and public acceptance, and cost-effective storage, then you don't have CCS. And people have done lots of numbers which they add up the pore space in reservoirs and say, that pore space, let's say it's got 5% efficiency. There's enough pore space in the world to store all the CO2 for thousands of years. The trouble is, the experience we had with ZeroGen, once we got in and understood, there are some no-go zones, whether it's public opposition, whether it's faults, etc., whether it's potential for water contamination. Then you've got some permeability and homogeneity issues with the reservoir. And so that affects injection rates and the number of wells you need, and suddenly you find, there might be plenty of pore space there. The only trouble is it's going to cost you about $150 a tonne over the life of the project to inject it. which means it's never going to happen. So you've got to find economic, scalable, and permittable or sanctionable storage resources. That's what we're doing for Australia. We've done a roadmap for Australia. We've been involved in roadmaps for elsewhere, but it's very much this high-level strategic approach to CCS as an option for 30, 50 years in the future, as opposed to something we think should be happening today. We also did, partly through the ZeroGen experience, a paper for the International Energy Agency on investment, like a risk-assured investment decision framework. So this is all about, understanding your storage resources before you do projects, coupling the projects at the right time, and having lots of independent reviews. So when all the projects I got involved in afterwards, what we generally found, and I describe these behaviours as either honest delusion or deliberate deception. People doing CCS projects in the world either had no clue what they were doing and preferred to stay oblivious to real costs and challenges and take DOE funding or whoever else was funding things, or they were, they did understand the issues but were deceiving funders and shareholders about the prospects. And so we put together this investment decision framework, which seems to be have gained acceptance certainly in the big industrial companies. And this is where we tend to work at UKIP, basically focused on storage and then looking at early stage what the opportunities might be. And so that was it, sorry. So that's a bit of a skim across what things interest us, not too much detail in any one area, but hopefully gives you an idea. Happy to take any questions. Sure.
Yes. Graham Taylor, that's Futures. I just want to talk about the question of system inertia and overshoot, which is that right now, of course, they talk about 2 degrees as being sort of the target, but in reality, we are with 1 degree that we're at right now. We've already seen we've lost 50% of the reefs in the world.
Yep.
Wars. We're losing the cryosphere. The ice is melting.
Yep.
And so in reality, a safe temperature, a safe stable temperature is back to before 320 parts per million,
yep.
back where it was in 1980.
Yep.
And so if your freezer is already melting, you're not going to achieve a stable temperature. You're not going to add by increasing by a degree or two. It's not going to happen. So the problem we have, as you say, is that on one hand, to change the global system in order to create non-polluting technologies is going to take decades. But we're already at critical tipping points right now. In fact, we have been for the last decade, or the last couple of decades. So, to me, this means that we're probably going to have to do geoengineering, or we need something that's going to buy us some time in order to make the transition. So I just wonder if you can.
So I agree with you. So I'm not advocating for 2 degrees C or 3 degrees C or 1 or 0. I'm really just saying energy appears to be something we're unable to do without. The transition to cleaner solutions appears to be slower and harder than anyone would like to think about. We obviously started way too late. So your point is clear. We started way too late on this journey. We've lost 20 years of, at least, of action. And we're still not taking action. So that's the big challenge we've got. I'm nervous about geoengineering. However, I would definitely think it has to be a part of major research initiatives. And for example, what I worry about geoengineering mainly, and I'm thinking about spraying aerosols into the atmosphere to stop warming, as an example. What I worry about is we will think about it. So nobody's really funding any serious research on that, right? And in fact, they've rejected it as a priority in the US. I worry that if things get too serious on the climate front, we will do that too quickly and without proper consideration of consequences, and end up with some unintended consequences that are perhaps unimaginable. And I also worry that if some countries, certain countries, were more affected by climate change, they might act sooner than others, and they may not be the best equipped scientifically and politically and with regulatory checks and balances to do it properly. So my view is that geoengineering should be front and centre on research agendas. I don't want to see us jump straight into it yet, but I fear that we just might have to, and therefore that's why I would be promoting to bring forward the research. But I'm with you in terms of, I don't say 2 degrees is too much, yeah, but it's inevitable now.
No. Yeah. Thanks, Chris. I was just thinking of the simplest one we know for carbon capture that technically works is just planting forests. What are the studies on that? How many trees per 1 10-ton person do you need? And not burning it, and just
just growing it. Yeah,
just growing.
Well, more than we've been doing. I mean, we are making a headway on that front, but we're still emissions are still increasing. So, and we're still deforesting. Yeah, but we are. Well, I think net we're going ahead. You probably know better than me. Net we're going ahead in forest cover, I think.
Well, there's increase in temperate rainforest and loss in tropical rainforest.
Yeah.
Places like Indonesia.
Sure, but globally,
there may be a slight increase, but
yeah,
it's not all matching.
No, it's not enough. Yeah.
The rate of increase in emissions.
Yeah.
And of course, when you're projecting the future, you can't solve that problem.
No, it appears to be not enough.
Great seminar, thank you. To me, your message to an engineer is obvious, that all of these things are almost certainly not going to be doable the way they're viewed just purely through the economic lens. It sounds to me like if you were able to simply emigrate to another planet, that would be the obvious choice. What is it you would do, since the only reason from a business perspective you're looking at this is we can't emigrate somewhere else?
No.
Walk away.
Well, I mean, it does point to the questions about do you do geoengineering, which is a pretty dramatic way to kind of reverse some of these things. It does point to the fact that we as engineers and scientists need to communicate a little bit better on these risks, and perhaps, you know, there are some scientists, for example, who say, I don't want to do CCS, that's not necessary, all I need is wind and solar. You know, I mean, scientists. To me, what I'm trying to do is alert people to this challenge is much, much bigger than anyone can appreciate.
But let's say we agree on that.
Yeah, we need everything.
If suddenly everyone said, yeah, we get it, okay, right.
So the answer, we need everything. So we need
a miracle.
Yeah, I actually don't think we're going to solve this problem, right? But we need everything. We need carbon capture and storage. We need geoengineering. So we can't be taking options off the table. We need nuclear.
Isn't what we really need to prepare ourselves to be living in?
And we need to, yeah. So part of our rapid switch project is about at least getting the conversation to be, we are going to have to pay attention to adaptation because we're not going to mitigate fast enough.
No.
Yeah.
It's impossible.
Yeah.
We'll take 2 more questions. So I'm American. My kids have all turned vegan after watching a movie called Pyrolysis. How important is livestock farming?
Yeah, very. Yeah, no. So yeah, all turning vegetarians are help, but of course then you got land use issues and so forth. You know, there's no solution here without some sort of consequence. You know, no perfect solutions. But look, agriculture and livestock production.
So why is it that it doesn't feature in any of the analysis?
Because my mandate is really around energy. We actually did fund some work on looking at cattle and how we could change their biome to reduce the amount of methane emissions, just a little bit. And you know, we just didn't have the expertise. But look, it's a big issue. Transport industry and energy is the bit I concentrate on. Agriculture and livestock is just a whole nother world. Probably not. And you know, the trend is only one way. I mean, the developing world is eating more meat.
Maybe you already answered these questions, but I remember in the late 80s when they all started talking about depletion of ozone layer. It was a big thing, everyone would talk about it. Now no one mentioned that. At least I don't know whether problem has solved, but I noticed lots of people are using sunscreen. Back to this. This topic is around us for 20 years, and the government hasn't thought that completely. What do you think that needs to happen in order to real action happen? Whether it's going to be some technical, profitable solution or environmental disaster?
Yeah, one of those.
What do you think at what points? I mean, how much time we have to one for either?
So let's go back to ozone layers and CFCs. We had a ready solution, right? That we had something that was economic, it was more sustainable, so that was easy. This is different. We don't have technologies, or we don't have a full suite of technologies which can competitively challenge the status quo. You know, and that's one of the things I say to my colleagues who keep telling me, "Oh, you're a merchant of doom. You know, all we need is solar panels. If the world just bought solar panels, everything would be fixed." Is to say, you know, no, that's rubbish. You know, we haven't delivered the solutions that can allow this transition to happen quickly, and I don't think we can. Now, environmental disasters, yes. Well, they're already happening, as Graham pointed out. That's still not sparing. You know, 50% of the global reefs, for example, doesn't seem to have persuaded certain people in politics that this is a serious issue yet. Part of that is because I think politicians do have some inkling of what the transition might cost, and no one wants to face up to that. So, yeah, more disasters. They're too late, of course, then.
Mine was just a really quick one, and that is, you know, it's wonderful for an audience like this to listen to this and take it in, and well, it's very depressing as well, but have you received any indication that anybody with any ability to change anything has taken notice of your work? So
I think you're referring to the whole rapid switch, how fast can we switch? It's an interesting one. So I first started waving my arms around about this issue probably 2013, 14. And there's a few people at Princeton who are superstars in the area, you know, front page of The Economist in their careers and that sort of stuff. And they first of all said, "Oh, you know, why is that important?" They, you know, within a year I had them saying, "Hey, this is the most important thing the world needs to be working on. Why haven't we thought about it before?" You know, I go to Exxon, I go to the head of the IPCC, go to the head of the IEA. Once we've found the way to articulate what we're talking about properly, everyone says, "Hey, that's the most important thing in the world." Turning that into money has been a bit of a challenge, and as I say, the two companies most enthusiastic about putting serious money in are BP and Exxon, which comes with some, you know, I'm not at all allergic to taking industry funds. I think good research has to happen in conjunction with industry, but we have to make sure that the findings are not in any way able to be discredited as a result. So we need foundations to be in the mix before we can actually take serious money from Exxon. Foundations, screen companies, whatever, you know. So everyone listens and says it's really important, but I think the other challenge everyone had, including all you know, people like the head of Exxon, the head of IPCC is go away and prove to me you've got a methodology that hangs together. Because I think whilst everyone said it's really important, everyone also realised it was really hard, and it has been. So I originally thought I would need you know, a small team for about 6 months. It's taken about 2 years to get to where I'm now confident that we have a robust methodology. And 2 years and about a team of 6 people, not a small team of 2 people. So high risk sort of project, in fact. You know, you're starting off with something you have no idea whether it's going to work or whether anyone's going to listen. And you're hoping that you can get something sensible out, which I think we've got to. Certainly we're getting insights which are pretty scary.
Maybe we can continue the discussion now. So thanks again for the presentation. It's been very useful. It was quite important.